Imagine a scenario where the world's two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, where the fate of millions hung in the balance, held hostage by the egos and ideologies of leaders possessing the capabilities to extinguish human civilization with the push of a button. This was the chilling reality the world faced in October of 1962 during the height of the Cold War, an event that would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 excruciating days, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a terrifying game of nuclear chicken, with Moscow deploying ballistic missiles into Cuba, capable of obliterating American cities, and Washington enforcing a naval blockade around the island. The slightest miscalculation could have triggered a holocaust of unimaginable proportions. From the halls of the Kremlin to the Situation Rooms of the White House, the crisis represented the closest the world had ever come to full-scale nuclear war, a confrontation where the world held its breath as the superpowers stared into the abyss of mutually assured destruction. Today on Revealing History, we'll go behind the scenes of the most dangerous superpower confrontation in history, exploring the high-stakes brinksmanship, the backroom negotiations, and the heroic actions that pulled us back from the point of no return. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro assumed power after a successful guerrilla war resulted in the overthrow of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The United States was interested in maintaining relations with Cuba and its new leader, who was not yet a communist. But during 1959 and 1960, relations between Cuba and the United States began to worsen as Castro voiced anti-U.S. rhetoric and refused to hold elections. Castro's pursuit of an alliance with the Soviet Union was the last straw for United States President Dwight Eisenhower, who cut off diplomatic ties with Cuba and ordered that plans to overthrow the Cuban dictator be drawn up. With support from the United States gone, Castro signed multi-trade agreements with the Soviet Union. They provided Cuba with arms and other weaponry, as well as political support within the international community. It was a win for both Cuba, who now had a world superpower as an ally, and the Soviet Union, who now had the capability of staging strategic assets only 90 miles from the coastal United States. In March 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to recruit and train Cuban exiles for an invasion to overthrow Castro. This plan was inherited and approved by President John F. Kennedy after he took office in 1961. On April 17, 1961, around 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exile forces landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba, with the aim of establishing a beachhead and inspiring a broader uprising against Castro. However, the invasion force was quickly outnumbered and defeated by Castro's revolutionary forces within 3 days, in part due to Kennedy's refusal to commit U.S. combat troops or provide direct air support. Over 100 exiles were killed and 1,189 captured. The failed invasion was an embarrassing setback for the U.S., and it strengthened Castro's grip on power in Cuba. It also pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the failed invasion, Castro turned to the Soviets, seeking protection from any future aggression by the United States. In response, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to provide Cuba with nuclear weapons. Khrushchev's reasoning for providing the nukes was that he wanted to protect Cuba and the Castro regime from U.S. aggression and to sway the balance of power in favor of the Soviet Union. In reality, the Soviet leader couldn't care less about the Cuban Revolution, Castro, or the Cuban people. But by secretly deploying nuclear missiles on the island, it gave the Soviet Union the ability to strike much of the continental United States with nuclear weapons from positions just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The strategic implications were significant. The secret, however, wouldn't be a secret for long. In mid-October 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was shown reconnaissance photos proving the existence of medium and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles on the island. The heat of the Cold War was about to be turned up substantially. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to evaluate options. After tense deliberations, he decided on a naval quarantine to prevent further Soviet weapons from reaching Cuba. In a televised address on October 22nd, Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles and his order to enforce, quote, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. In addition to the blockade, Kennedy demanded the unconditional removal of all nuclear missiles from Cuba. He also ordered contingency plans for a full-scale invasion of Cuba and a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union if they didn't comply. Things were getting real very fast. The U.S. military went on high alert, positioning forces for a potential invasion of Cuba. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 naval ships were assigned to the quarantine line. These included aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and submarines, which were not only part of the blockade, but were ready to launch air assets and naval gunfire against Soviet and Cuban forces. Marine Corps and Navy assault teams were also positioned for a possible invasion of the island. Initially, Khrushchev refused to acknowledge that there were nuclear weapons in Cuba and declared the blockade an act of war against the Soviet Union. Ships carrying Soviet missiles approached the quarantine line, but thankfully turned back at the last minute. And Khrushchev eventually suspended all weapons deliveries that were currently on their way to Cuba. For 13 days, the world watched as the two superpowers came perilously close to direct military confrontation and potential nuclear war. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating in hopes of resolving the situation peacefully. On 28 October, Khrushchev announced he would dismantle the missile sites and return the weapons to the Soviet Union. In a secret deal, the U.S. also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, which the Soviet leaders saw as a direct threat, in the same way that leaders in the United States saw the missiles in Cuba. By late November, the crisis was resolved as both sides followed through on removing their missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the Cold War had come to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. It led to the installation of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to manage future crises. The near-catastrophic event also spurred efforts to ban atmospheric nuclear testing and reduce the threat of nuclear proliferation. While Khrushchev's brinkmanship did fail and would ultimately lead to his ouster as Soviet premier, the crisis demonstrated that the Soviet Union had the ability to challenge U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. It also exposed the recklessness of nuclear brinksmanship, prompting both sides to adopt more flexible policies to avoid direct confrontation. And as mentioned earlier, Khrushchev really wasn't concerned for the Cuban people or their leader. During negotiations with Kennedy, Castro was never consulted. He had hoped to include in the negotiations the closing of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay and the end of all U-2 flights over his country. His concerns were never brought up to Kennedy. So how close did we really come to war with the Soviets? According to many details that were not known until decades afterwards, we came extremely close. According to President Kennedy, the chance of escalation to war was, quote, between 1 in 3 and even. His advisors believed that the airstrike and invasion plan for the third week could have triggered a Soviet nuclear response against American forces and cities like Miami. In Cuba, Soviet forces had already received tactical nuclear warheads for their artillery rockets and bombers by the time the crisis began. And Fidel Castro stated that he would have recommended using them had the U.S. invaded. And on October 27th, a day known as Black Saturday, a Soviet submarine commander came extremely close to launching a nuclear torpedo against the U.S. Navy after enduring hours of depth charge attacks and being forced to surface. According to documents disclosed after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet commander and his crew had prepared to make a nuclear strike if the attacks had continued. This could have escalated into an all-out nuclear exchange had they done so. And Kennedy's own secret White House recordings captured the immense pressure and real possibility of nuclear war as he and his advisors debated military options against the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And some of their options included a nuclear strike. And had that occurred, the Soviets would have most assuredly responded in kind. The Cuban Missile Crisis represented the pinnacle of Cold War nuclear brinksmanship. With both superpowers' nuclear arsenals fully prepared, a single miscalculation or overly aggressive action could have triggered an apocalyptic nuclear exchange. Fortunately, that was narrowly avoided. The Cold War was a fascinating and at times a perilous chapter in the history of the world. It was a period of immense geopolitical significance that shaped the second half of the 20th century, and in many ways, its effects are still felt today. The Cold War lasted from 1947 to 1991, and during that time, there was a lot going on. But despite being one of the most defining periods of the 20th century, there are many details that many people still aren't aware of. This is especially true about the Soviet Union, that took great pains in keeping a lot of its secrets, well, secret. But when the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, many of these secrets were revealed. Some of them will amaze you. To learn about 20 crazy Cold War facts that may surprise you, click the screen now. And until next time, thanks for watching this episode of Revealing History.